Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to another story here on the A Thread of Hope channel. I'm so happy to be with you today to share a narrative that will deeply touch your hearts. Today, we're going to get to know Leah, a young woman of only 19 who, despite facing life's greatest difficulties, carries a purity and a strength that few can maintain. In the midst of despair, she makes a decision that will completely change her destiny. On the other side, we have Brandon, a millionaire who has built walls around his heart, but who will discover that some encounters can break down any barrier. Between them, a contract that should have been purely financial will turn into something much deeper. But can love overcome all differences? And what happens when society tries to tear apart two hearts that have already found each other? I want to thank each of you who follows our channel, who leaves kind comments, and who shares our stories with others. You make all the difference in our journey. And if you're not yet part of our family, subscribe to the channel now and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the next stories we've prepared, especially for you. Tell me in the comments what you do while you listen to our stories. Are you working, exercising, cooking, or just relaxing? I love to know how our narratives are a part of your daily life. Now, let's begin our story. Prepare your heart, because this journey promises to be emotional from the very first moment. In Charlotte, on a cold morning in July, Leah woke up to the insistent sound of someone knocking on the door. She knew exactly what that meant. The owner of the small room she rented was there once again to collect the overdue rent. At 19, she had already been through so many hardships, it seemed like she had lived a whole lifetime. An orphan since she was 14, when she lost her parents in a car accident, Leah had to learn to fend for herself very early. With no close relatives to help, she ended up in a shelter until she turned 18. When she left, full of dreams and hope, she thought she would finally be able to build a decent life for herself. But reality was much harsher than she imagined. The job at the downtown diner barely covered the rent for the tiny room she lived in. It was a space so small it could barely fit a twin bed, an old wardrobe, and a small table where she ate her meals. The bathroom was shared with other tenants in the boarding house, and often didn't have hot water. Even so, Leah always kept everything clean and organized. She had learned as a child that dignity didn't depend on the size of a house or the amount of money in her pocket. It depended on how a person carried themselves in the face of hardship. And she always tried to hold her head high, even when everything seemed to be falling apart around her. On that particular morning, as she listened to the knocking, she knew that once again she would have to face the reality of not having money to pay her bills. When Mr. Jenkins knocked for the third time, Leah finally got up and went to answer. She knew she couldn't pay the rent. The money she earned at the diner barely covered food, and even then, she spent some days eating only bread and butter. "Leah, you know why I'm here," Mr. Jenkins said, in a more serious tone than usual. He was a man in his 60s, with gray hair, who was usually understanding of tenants in difficulty, but this time was different. "It's already 3 months overdue. I understand your situation, but I have bills to pay too. If you don't bring me at least half of what you owe by Friday, I'll have to ask you to leave." His words fell like a bucket of cold water on Leah. She felt her legs tremble, and for a moment thought she was going to faint. The possibility of being on the street was something that haunted her every night. "Please, Mr. Jenkins, give me 1 more week. I'm trying to get more work. Maybe some cleaning on the weekends." Leah spoke with a choked voice, trying to hold back the tears that insisted on welling up. She knew crying wouldn't solve anything, but it was hard to keep her composure in the face of another desperate situation. Mr. Jenkins looked at her with pity, but shook his head. "Leah, I've already given you several chances. This time I'm serious. Friday is the limit." After he left, Leah collapsed on the bed and finally let the tears flow. She felt completely lost, not knowing where to go or what to do. The idea of returning to the streets terrified her. She had seen other girls her age in similar situations and knew that the paths that opened up for them were rarely dignified. The fear of having to submit to degrading situations to survive made her stomach churn. For the rest of the morning, Leah tried to focus on her chores. She washed the few clothes she had, tidied her room, and made some weak tea to try to calm her nerves. As she stirred the warm drink in her chipped mug, she reflected on her life. She had always been a studious, dreamy girl. She wanted to go to college, maybe become a teacher or a nurse. Professions that would allow her to help other people. But when her parents died, all those dreams had to be stored in a deep drawer of her heart. Reality demanded that she work to survive, and there was no time or money to study. Even so, Leah never completely lost hope. She believed that one day things would get better, that she would be able to get out of her situation. But at that moment, with the threat of eviction hanging over her head, it was hard to maintain that faith. The tears flowed down her face again as she thought about how unfair life had been to her. In the afternoon, when she arrived at the diner for another day of work, Leah was visibly dejected. Mrs. Rose, the owner of the establishment, a woman in her 50s with a huge heart, immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened, my dear? You look terrible," Mrs. Rose asked while tying her apron. Leah hesitated for a moment, but decided to tell her everything. Mrs. Rose listened attentively, shaking her head with concern. "Oh, my dear, if I could help you more, I would. But you know how hard it is here, too." It was true. The diner, which used to be packed at lunchtime, now only received a few loyal customers. The economic downturn was affecting everyone, and Mrs. Rose had already mentioned that she might have to reduce operating hours. The situation was difficult for everyone, not just for Leah. At the end of her shift, as Leah was wiping down the tables and getting ready to leave, Mrs. Rose approached with an old newspaper in her hands. "Leah, I was looking at the classifieds here, and I saw something that might interest you. I'm not sure what it's about, but it's offering a very good amount." She showed her a small ad in the corner of the page. It was discreet, almost unnoticeable among so many others. Seeking healthy young woman, between 18 and 25 years old, for a well-compensated medical procedure. Absolute confidentiality. Interested parties should apply at St. Raphael's Clinic, Elm Street 234, from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Leah read the ad several times, frowning. It was too vague. It didn't explain exactly what it was about. But the amount mentioned caught her attention. It was 10 times more than she earned in a month at the diner. Her heart raced just thinking about the possibility of earning so much money at once. "Mrs. Rose, do you think it could be something serious?" Leah asked, still looking at the paper. Mrs. Rose shrugged. "I don't know, honey. It could be medical research, drug testing, those things that labs do, or it could be nonsense. But if I were you, I would at least go take a look. What do you have to lose?" It was a good question. Leah really didn't have much to lose at that moment. She was desperate, out of options. And any possibility of earning honest money deserved at least to be investigated. "You're right. I'll go there tomorrow and check it out," Leah decided, folding the newspaper and putting it in her bag. As she walked home down the dark street, she felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. She didn't know what awaited her the next day, but something inside her told her that her life was about to change completely. The mysterious ad could be the answer to all her problems, or it could just be another disappointment in a life already full of them. What do you think Leah will find at the clinic? Is she right to risk everything for this mysterious offer? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The next morning, Leah woke up earlier than usual. She had spent the whole night thinking about the ad in the newspaper, building expectations, and imagining all the possibilities. She chose her best outfit, a navy blue skirt and a simple white blouse, both well kept, despite being a bit faded by time. She wanted to make a good impression, whatever that medical procedure was. She took a long shower, carefully combed her brown hair, and even put on a little lipstick that Mrs. Rose had given her for her birthday. When she looked in the small, stained mirror in her room, she saw a pretty girl with delicate features, but with eyes that revealed all the hardship she had faced in life. Even so, there was a determination there, a strength she didn't even know she possessed. St. Raphael's Clinic was in a wealthy part of Charlotte, very different from the neighborhood where Leah lived. When she got off the bus and started walking down Elm Street, she felt completely out of her element. The houses were large, with well-kept gardens and imported cars parked in front. The clinic itself was a modern building, all glass, with an elegant reception area that looked more like the entrance to a luxury hotel. Leah hesitated at the door for a moment, wondering if she really belonged there. But the memory of Mr. Jenkins and the threat of eviction made her take a deep breath and go inside. The receptionist, an elegant woman in her 30s, greeted her with a professional smile. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" Leah showed her the ad from the newspaper, and the woman's demeanor immediately changed, becoming more serious. "Ah, yes. You're here about the procedure. Please wait a moment." While she waited in a comfortable armchair in the waiting room, Leah observed the environment around her. Everything was very clean, very organized, very different from anywhere she frequented. There were expensive magazines on the coffee table, paintings on the walls, and soft music playing in the background. She began to wonder once again what exactly that medical procedure would be. Her hands were sweating, and she rubbed them nervously on her skirt. After about 20 minutes, a tall woman in a dark suit with her hair in a perfect bun appeared at the reception desk. "Leah," she stood up immediately. "That's me." The woman approached and held out her hand. "My name is Helen. I'm a lawyer. Would you please come with me?" Leah followed her down an elegant corridor to a meeting room. There, sitting in a leather chair, was a man who made her heart race instantly. Brandon was 35 years old, with well-cut dark hair, penetrating eyes, and a presence that exuded authority. He wore an expensive suit and a watch that probably cost more than Leah earned in several years, and he had a presence that completely dominated the room. When she came in, he looked her up and down, not in an invasive way, but like someone who was assessing something important. "Please have a seat," he said in a deep, controlled voice. Leah sat in the chair he indicated, trying to maintain her composure, but feeling small in the presence of that imposing man. Helen positioned herself next to Brandon and opened a folder full of documents. "Leah, before we start our conversation, I need you to sign a confidentiality agreement. Everything that is discussed here cannot be mentioned to anyone, regardless of whether you accept our proposal or not." Leah took the paper and read it quickly. There were many complicated words, but the essence was clear. She couldn't talk about it with anyone. After she signed the document, Brandon leaned forward and looked her directly in the eyes. "Leah, I'm going to be direct with you. I need a surrogate. I want to have a child, but I have no intention of getting married or having romantic relationships. I'm looking for a healthy young woman who can carry my heir through artificial medical procedures." His words took her completely by surprise. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was hearing. A surrogate? Was this what it was about? "I understand this is an unusual proposal," Brandon continued, "but I'm willing to compensate you very well financially. You would receive an amount throughout the pregnancy, full medical coverage, a place to live, food, everything you need. and in the end, an amount that would allow you to start a new life. Helen opened the folder and showed her a paper with numbers. When Leah saw the total amount, she almost fainted. It was more money than she could save in 10 years of working at the diner. "I know it's a lot of information to process," Helen said in a softer tone. "But we want you to understand exactly what this is about. The procedure would be completely artificial, done here at the clinic under the supervision of Dr. Marcus, one of the best fertilization specialists in the region. You would have no physical contact with Mr. Brandon, other than what is necessary for medical exams. After the child is born, you would hand over the baby and move on with your life. Obviously, this would be a legal contract, with all the guarantees for both parties." Leah felt her head spinning. It was a proposal she had never imagined receiving. While the amount of money solved all her problems, the idea of carrying a stranger's child and then giving it up was something that deeply affected her feelings. "May I ask why you don't want to get married or adopt a child?" she managed to say, surprised by her own courage to ask. Brandon was silent for a moment, and Leah noticed a shadow pass through his eyes. "Those are personal matters," he replied coldly. "The important thing is that you understand this would be a strictly professional agreement. There would be no emotional involvement from either party. You would be well cared for during the pregnancy, but when the child is born, our paths would separate for good." The harshness of his words made Leah shiver. It was obvious that this man had built high walls around himself, and she wondered what kind of pain had made him so cold. Helen continued explaining the details of the contract, the medical exams Leah would have to undergo, the monitoring during the pregnancy, and the rules she would have to follow. It was a lot of information, but the young woman tried to absorb it all, even with her heart racing and her mind confused. "You don't have to decide now," Brandon said, getting up from the chair. "Take these documents home, read them carefully, think it over. If you decide to accept, contact us in the next 3 days. If not, just discard the papers and go on with your life as if this conversation never happened." He handed her a sealed envelope. Inside is a copy of the contract and all the financial details. But remember, all of this is absolutely confidential. Leah took the envelope with trembling hands. She was so nervous she could barely speak. "Thank you for the opportunity," she murmured. Helen escorted her to the exit, and when Leah found herself on the street again, she felt as if she had just woken up from a very strange dream. She walked toward the bus stop with the envelope clutched to her chest, still trying to believe what had just happened. Her simple, predictable life had just been turned upside down by a proposal that could change everything. What do you think is behind Brandon's coldness, and why did he choose Leah specifically? And how would you feel if you were in Leah's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Leah spent the next 3 days on an emotional roller coaster. She read the contract over and over, trying to understand all the clauses and implications. The money offered was truly an amount that would change her life completely. She could pay off all her debts, take a course, maybe even start a small business of her own. But the idea of carrying a stranger's child and then giving it up deeply affected her. She talked to herself for hours, weighing the pros and cons. On the evening of the 3rd day, when Mr. Jenkins appeared again demanding the rent with an unfriendly look, Leah made her decision. She called the number Helen had given her and scheduled a meeting for the next day. When she hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of relief and terror. She was about to embark on a journey she didn't know where it would lead. At the next meeting, Helen greeted her with a warmer smile. "I'm glad you decided to accept our proposal, Leah. I'm sure it will be a positive experience for everyone involved." They spent more than 2 hours reviewing every point of the contract. Leah would have to move into an apartment Brandon would provide, undergo regular medical exams, follow a specific diet, and avoid any situation that could harm a future pregnancy. In return, she would receive a generous monthly allowance in addition to the final amount after the baby's birth. When she finally signed all the papers, Leah felt as if she were signing a pact that would change her life forever. Helen handed her the keys to an apartment and a credit card for her expenses. "Dr. Marcus is expecting you tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon for the first exams. From now on, you are our responsibility." The apartment Brandon had provided was a completely different world from the tiny room Leah lived in. It was in an upper-middle-class neighborhood and had 2 bedrooms, a spacious living room, a modern kitchen, and even a small laundry area. When she opened the door for the first time, she could hardly believe that this place would be hers for the next few months. It was clean, tastefully furnished, with everything she needed. For the first time in a long time, Leah felt safe. She wouldn't have to worry about rent, food, or basic bills. She could sleep peacefully, without worrying about landlords knocking on her door to collect. Even so, a part of her felt like she was living a borrowed life, as if all of this wasn't really hers. It was a strange feeling, a mix of gratitude and a melancholy she couldn't explain. Dr. Marcus was a middle-aged man with gray hair, glasses, and a paternal demeanor that put Leah at ease from the first meeting. His clinic was modern and well-equipped, and he explained the entire artificial fertilization process with a patience she didn't expect. "Leah, I want you to feel completely comfortable asking any questions. This is a delicate process, and it's important that you understand every step." He explained that first she would go through a series of exams to confirm she was in perfect health. Then they would start hormonal treatments to prepare her body to receive the embryo. The entire process would be closely monitored, and she would have constant medical supervision. "It's a safe and common procedure today," the doctor assured her. "You are in excellent hands." During the first few weeks, Leah adapted to her new routine. She visited Dr. Marcus twice a week, took the prescribed medications, and strictly followed the recommended diet. Brandon would sometimes appear at the clinic to check on the exams, but he always kept a respectful distance. He was polite, asked about her health and well-being, but never tried to talk about personal matters. It was obvious that he wanted to keep the agreement strictly professional, as he had made clear from the start. Even so, Leah began to watch him more closely during these visits. She noticed that behind all that coldness, there was a deeply lonely man. Sometimes she would catch him looking out the window with a melancholic expression, and she would wonder what kind of life he led, what kind of past had made him so closed off to relationships. When the day for the fertilization procedure arrived, Leah was nervous but determined. She had prepared herself mentally for that moment for weeks. She arrived at the clinic in the morning, went through all the routine exams, and was taken to the procedure room. Dr. Marcus greeted her with his usual reassuring smile. "Everything is perfect, Leah. Your exams are excellent. Your body is prepared. And today we will start this process. In a few hours, it will all be complete." She lay on the bed, trying to relax while the doctor prepared the equipment. Brandon was in the next room, where he would provide the necessary genetic material. It was strange to think that this man she barely knew would be the biological father of the child she would carry. But she tried not to think too much about it, focusing only on the medical and professional aspects of the situation. It was then that things started to go wrong. Dr. Marcus was preparing the fertilization equipment when something started making a strange noise. He frowned, tried a few adjustments, but the noise persisted. "What an unfortunate situation," he murmured, adjusting the controls. After a few minutes of trying to solve the problem, he left the room and returned with a worried expression. "Leah, we have a technical problem. The equipment has a failure in the cooling system, and that compromises the entire process. I'm going to have to cancel the procedure for today." Leah felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. She had prepared so much psychologically for that moment that canceling now felt like a frustrating anticlimax. "When can we reschedule, doctor?" "That's the problem," he replied, scratching his head. "This equipment will need specialized maintenance. It could take 2 or 3 weeks to get the replacement parts." Dr. Marcus left to talk to Brandon about the situation, and Leah heard raised voices coming from the next room. She couldn't understand exactly what they were saying, but it was obvious that Brandon was not at all happy with the unexpected problem. After a conversation that seemed to last an eternity, Dr. Marcus returned to the room where she was waiting, accompanied by Brandon. The expression on both of their faces was serious. "Leah," the doctor began, "we have a delicate situation. Mr. Brandon has travel commitments that make it impossible to reschedule the procedure for the next few weeks. And there is a specific window in your hormonal cycle that, if we miss it, will require us to start the entire treatment from scratch." She looked from one to the other, trying to understand where this was going. "There is an alternative," Dr. Marcus continued, obviously uncomfortable. "But it's an alternative that requires a very mature decision from both parties." "What alternative?" Leah asked, her heart racing. Dr. Marcus exchanged a look with Brandon before answering. "The procedure can be done in a natural way, without equipment. It's less common today, but it's equally effective from a medical standpoint. Obviously, this would completely change the nature of the procedure. It would no longer be something totally impersonal." Leah felt her face flush completely. She was understanding exactly what the doctor was suggesting. She looked at Brandon, who maintained a neutral expression, but she could see a tension in his eyes. "I understand it's a difficult decision," Dr. Marcus said. "You don't have to decide now. You can go home, think about it carefully, and give me an answer tomorrow. But I have to be honest. If we don't do it now, we will have to wait at least 2 months for a new opportunity, considering the hormonal treatments and Mr. Brandon's schedule." The silence that settled in the room after Dr. Marcus's words was almost deafening. Leah felt her heart beating so fast she was sure everyone could hear it. She looked at Brandon, trying to decipher his thoughts through the mask of coldness he always wore. He was staring at his hands, as if he were fighting an intense internal battle. Dr. Marcus, sensing the awkwardness of the situation, tried to make everything more medical and less personal. From a clinical point of view, the result would be exactly the same. Natural conception is, in fact, the method that nature has developed over millions of years. Many couples who undergo fertility treatment end up opting for this alternative in similar situations. But even with all the scientific explanation, everyone knew that this would completely change the dynamic between them. Brandon finally looked up and looked directly at Leah. "The decision is yours," he said in a lower voice than usual. "I will perfectly understand if you want to give up. I can cancel my trip and we can wait until the equipment is repaired." There was something in his voice that Leah couldn't identify. It was as if he was also nervous, despite trying to maintain that controlled posture. She realized that, for the first time since she had met him, Brandon seemed vulnerable. "I need to think," she managed to say, getting up from the bed. "Can I have until tomorrow?" Dr. Marcus nodded. "Of course. It's a decision that cannot be made in a hurry. Talk, think carefully, and let me know what you've decided tomorrow." When they left the clinic, Brandon offered Leah a ride, which she would normally refuse, but this time she accepted. She needed to better understand who this man was. During the ride to the apartment, they were silent for the most part. Leah watched Brandon's profile as he drove, noticing for the first time small details she hadn't noticed before. There was a small scar near his right ear. His hands were large and strong, and she noticed that he had a habit of clenching his jaw when he was deep in thought. When they stopped in front of the building where she lived, he turned off the engine and just looked straight ahead for a moment. "Leah, I want you to know that whatever your decision, I will completely respect it. This contract was never intended to put you in an uncomfortable situation." She looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Why is it so important for you? To have a child, I mean." Brandon was silent for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a pain that he was trying to hide. "My company will be passed down to the next generation of the family. My father built everything from scratch, and now it's my responsibility to ensure that it continues. But I will never marry." The words came out harsher than he probably intended. Leah felt that there was much more to that explanation. Never? Why? She was surprised by her own courage to ask. Brandon looked her in the eyes for the first time during the whole conversation. "Because love only brings pain, and I have already suffered enough in life." There was a deep sadness in those eyes that made Leah's heart ache. She realized that this man, behind all the wealth and power, carried wounds that had probably never properly healed. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, "for what happened to you in the past." Brandon seemed surprised by her sincerity, and for a moment, his mask of coldness fell completely. Leah spent the whole night awake, thinking about everything that had happened. The situation had become much more complex than she had imagined at the beginning. It was no longer just a matter of medical procedure and money. There were feelings involved, even if neither of them wanted to admit it. She thought about the life she could have with that money, the security she had never experienced, the possibility of finally having a decent future. But she also thought about the baby she would carry, the lonely man who would be the father, and how she felt strangely connected to Brandon, despite barely knowing him. When dawn broke, she had already made her decision. She called Dr. Marcus and said she wanted to proceed with the procedure, regardless of how it was done. There was something inside her that told her this was the right thing to do. What do you think is the real reason Leah decided to proceed with the natural procedure? And will this decision change the dynamic between them? Or will the contract remain strictly professional? Share your thoughts in the comments below. When they arrived at the clinic the next afternoon, the atmosphere was completely different from the day before. Dr. Marcus received them with professionalism, but it was obvious that he was also nervous about the situation. "I've prepared a special suite for you," he said, leading them down a corridor that Leah didn't know. "It's a more private, more comfortable environment. I want you to feel as at ease as possible." The suite was indeed different from the rest of the clinic. It looked more like an elegant hotel room than a medical room. There was a large bed, soft lighting, and quiet ambient music. Dr. Marcus explained some medical details about what was important to maximize the chances of conception, but then he left them alone. "Call if you need anything," he said before leaving, closing the door behind him. The silence that followed was one of the most awkward in Leah's life. She was there, in the same room as Brandon, knowing exactly what was going to happen, but not knowing how to start. He also seemed uncomfortable, walking around the room, fidgeting with random objects, avoiding looking directly at her. "Leah," he finally said, stopping in front of the window, "I want you to know that I will try to make this as least awkward as possible for you. I know it's your first time, and I promise to be careful." The fact that he had noticed her inexperience made her even more nervous, but it also brought a strange relief. At least he understood her situation. "Thank you," she managed to reply. "I also want this to be respectful." He turned to look at her bureau, and she saw a tenderness in his eyes that she didn't expect. "It always will be," he promised. When they finally approached each other, Leah felt as if the whole world had stopped. Brandon slowly lifted his hand and touched her face with a gentleness she had never experienced. "Are you sure?" he asked one last time. She just nodded, not trusting her own voice. What happened next was completely different from what she had imagined. Brandon was incredibly kind, patient, and caring. He kissed her slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, and she felt something awaken within her that she had never felt before. It wasn't just physical desire. It was a deep connection, an emotional intimacy that went far beyond what any contract could foresee. When he touched her for the first time, she trembled not with fear, but with an overwhelming emotion she couldn't name. The moment she gave herself completely was transformative for both of them. Leah felt as if she was discovering a part of herself that had always existed, but had never been awakened. And Brandon, despite all his experience, seemed equally touched by her purity and surrender. There were tears in Leah's eyes, not of pain, but of an intense happiness she didn't know was possible to feel. Afterward, as they lay side by side, she realized that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer just two people fulfilling a contract. They were two souls who had connected in a way that neither expected. Brandon looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "And maybe he was, Leah," he murmured, stroking her hair. "You are extraordinary." In that moment, she knew that her life would never be the same again. In the weeks that followed that day at the clinic, both Leah and Brandon tried to return to their normal routines, but both knew that something had irreversibly changed between them. Leah continued to live in the apartment he had provided, undergoing follow-up exams with Dr. Marcus and strictly following all medical recommendations. Brandon maintained his work schedule, his business commitments, and his important meetings. But there was a tension in the air whenever they met at the clinic, an energy that neither of them knew how to handle. They would greet each other politely, exchange information about the medical exams, but avoided any more personal topics. It was as if both were trying to pretend that that intimate afternoon had never happened, even though they knew it was impossible to forget. When Dr. Marcus confirmed that Leah was pregnant, 3 weeks after the procedure, the news brought a complex mix of emotions for both of them. Leah felt a deep joy, mixed with an anxiety she couldn't explain. She was carrying Brandon's child, something that was supposed to be just a job, but that now felt much more significant. Brandon, in turn, showed a contained satisfaction when he received the news. But Leah noticed something different in his eyes. There was a genuine concern, a care that went beyond financial interest in the baby. "How are you feeling?" he asked her after Dr. Marcus left the room. It was the first personal question he had asked since that day. "Good," she replied, "a little nauseous in the morning, but the doctor said it's normal." He nodded, but continued to look at her as if he wanted to say something more and didn't know how. As the days passed, Brandon began to appear more frequently. At first, he always had a plausible excuse. He wanted to know about the exams, needed to discuss something with Dr. Marcus, had to review some detail of the contract with Helen. But Leah noticed that he was finding reasons to be around. Sometimes he would offer her a ride when she left the clinic. Other times, he would show up at the apartment with the excuse of checking if she needed anything. During these visits, they would talk about trivial things, the weather, the news, how she was adapting to the apartment. But there was a growing intimacy in these conversations, an ease that didn't exist before. Leah began to see beyond the cold mask Brandon always wore, and what she found was a man much more complex and vulnerable than she had imagined. One afternoon, when she was feeling particularly nauseous, Brandon appeared at the apartment and found her lying on the sofa, pale and visibly uncomfortable. Without hesitation, he went to the kitchen, made a cup of ginger tea that he said he had learned from his mother, and sat next to her as she drank it slowly. "My mother always did this when I was sick," he commented, watching her drink the tea. It was the first time he had mentioned his family in a personal way. She was an incredible woman. She took care of everyone, always knew exactly what to do in any situation. There was a deep longing in his voice, which made Leah realize that he had lost his mother. "She died when I was 25, Brandon continued, as if he had read her thoughts. "Cancer. It was very quick." Leah instinctively reached out and touched his hand. "I'm so sorry. It must have been very difficult." He looked at her hand on his, but didn't pull it away. It was at that moment that Leah began to understand why Brandon was so closed off to relationships. In the conversations that followed, he gradually revealed pieces of his story. He had fallen deeply in love at 28, with a woman named Camilla. They had plans to get married, dreams of building a family together. But 6 months before the wedding, he discovered she was having an affair with his best friend, and was only with him for the money and status he provided. The betrayal had been discovered in the worst possible way. He found them together in the house he had bought to be their home after the wedding. "On that day, a part of me died," Brandon confessed on a rainy afternoon as they had coffee in the apartment kitchen. "I promised myself I would never again allow anyone to get so close that they could destroy me like that." Leah's heart ached at hearing that story. She understood now why he had built all those barriers. As the pregnancy progressed, Leah noticed changes not only in her body, but also in Brandon's behavior. He had become more attentive, more present. Sometimes he would show up at the apartment with fruit he had bought, because he remembered that Dr. Marcus had recommended it. Other times, he would appear with books about pregnancy that he said he had found by chance. On one occasion, he arrived with a mobile for the baby's room, claiming that Helen had suggested he get used to the idea of being a father. But Leah realized that it wasn't Helen who was behind all that attention. It was he himself who was, little by little, allowing himself to get emotionally involved in the situation. And with her too, although neither of them wanted to admit it. The conversations between them became more intimate, more personal. Brandon told her about his fears of being a father, about the pressure he felt to maintain the family's legacy, about how he sometimes felt lonely even when he was always surrounded by people. Leah, in turn, talked about her interrupted dreams, about what it was like to grow up without a family, about the fear she had for the future. They discovered they had more in common than they imagined. Both knew deep loneliness. Both had learned to be strong out of necessity. Both carried scars that they rarely showed to other people. "You know," Leah said one night, when they were sitting on the apartment balcony looking at the stars, "sometimes I think our paths crossed for a reason bigger than just having a baby." Brandon looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. One morning, when Leah was 4 months pregnant, she woke up with a strange pain in her lower abdomen. It wasn't strong, but it was persistent, and she became worried. She called Brandon even before calling Dr. Marcus, and he arrived at the apartment in less than 20 minutes. He was visibly nervous, more worried than the situation really called for. He took her to the clinic immediately, where Dr. Marcus ran all the exams and confirmed that everything was fine, that it was just normal pregnancy discomfort. But the whole time they were at the hospital, Brandon stayed by her side, holding her hand, constantly asking if she was okay. It was at that moment that Leah realized he was no longer there just as the biological father of the child. He was there as someone who cared deeply for her, and she also had to admit to herself that her feelings for him had evolved far beyond what the contract provided for. She was falling in love with this complicated, wounded, but fundamentally good man who had entered her life in the most unexpected way possible. What do you think is the real reason Brandon is changing his behavior? Do you think he can truly overcome the trauma from his past and love Leah? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The realization that she was falling in love with Brandon brought an anguish to Leah that she hadn't expected. At night, lying in bed in the apartment he had provided, she would catch herself thinking about him much more than she should. She remembered the gentle touch of his hands that day at the clinic, the kind way he made her tea when she wasn't feeling well, the moments when he let his guard down and showed his vulnerability. But whenever these thoughts came, she forced herself to remember that all of this was temporary. The contract was clear. After the baby was born, they would go their separate ways. She would receive the agreed-upon money, and Brandon would keep his heir. That's how things had to be, and she couldn't allow feelings to complicate a situation that was already delicate on its own. But it was easier said than done, especially when he kept showing up almost every day with some excuse to see her. Brandon was also fighting an intense internal battle, although he tried to hide it from everyone, including himself. He had promised himself years ago that he would never again allow himself to feel something deep for a woman. And now he found himself breaking that promise almost involuntarily. He couldn't stop thinking about Leah. During work meetings, he would catch himself wondering how she was, if she wasn't feeling nauseous, if she was eating properly. When he came home at night, to the empty mansion that had been his refuge for so long, he felt a loneliness he hadn't experienced in years. It was as if Leah's presence in his life had illuminated dark corners he didn't even know existed. But every time he caught himself thinking like this, he forced himself to remember Camilla, the pain of the betrayal, how naive he had been to believe that someone could truly love him. Leah is different, a voice whispered inside his head. She's not here for the money, another part of him tried to argue, but the voice of reason, cold and calculating, always won. Everyone has a price. She's here for the money, exactly. The tension between them began to become palpable during their meetings at the clinic. Dr. Marcus, who was following the whole situation closely, realized that something had changed in the dynamic between his patients. They were still polite to each other, but there was an electricity in the air that hadn't existed at the beginning of the treatment. Sometimes he would catch them looking at each other when they thought no one was watching. Other times, he would notice how Brandon positioned himself protectively near Leah during exams. "You two need to be careful," Dr. Marcus said to Brandon in a private conversation after a consultation. "Situations like this can get emotionally complicated very quickly. It's important to stay focused on the main objective." Brandon assured him that everything was under control, but Dr. Marcus wasn't completely convinced. He knew human nature well enough to know that feelings rarely obeyed legal contracts. One night, when Leah was 5 months pregnant, Brandon showed up at the apartment later than usual. She was in the kitchen preparing a snack when she heard the key in the lock. She had given him a copy to use in emergencies, but he always knocked before entering. This time, he didn't knock. When she went to see what was happening, she found him sitting on the living room sofa with his head in his hands. There was something different about him, a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Brandon, what happened?" she asked, approaching him slowly. He looked up at her, and Leah saw that his eyes were red. "Today marks 7 years since my mother died," he said with a choked voice. "And for the first time in all these years, I didn't want to be alone." The confession took her completely by surprise. Without thinking twice, she sat down next to him and hugged him. It was an instinctive gesture of pure affection, but it broke down all the barriers they had so carefully built. Brandon allowed himself to be hugged for a few minutes, allowing himself to feel the comfort she offered. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to be vulnerable in front of anyone that he had almost forgotten how good it felt. "She would have liked you," he murmured against Leah's hair. "My mother always said that I would find someone who would make me want to be a better person. I think she was right." Leah's heart raced with those words. It was the first time he had spoken about her in personal terms, that he had admitted he gained something other than professional interest. "Brandon," she began, but he suddenly pulled away, as if he had realized he was going too far. "I'm sorry," he said, getting up from the sofa. "I shouldn't have come here like this. I shouldn't have said those things." But Leah also stood up and held his arm. "Why not? Why can't you be honest about what you're feeling?" He looked her in the eyes, and she saw a war going on there. "Because that wasn't part of the agreement," Brandon replied, but his voice didn't have its usual firmness. "Because you two are temporary in my life, you and the baby. When all this is over, you'll go your separate ways, and I'll go mine." His words hurt Leah more than she expected. "You two?" she repeated. "You're talking about the baby as if it's only mine, not yours." Brandon ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "The baby will be mine, legally, financially, in all the ways that matter. But emotionally," he stopped, as if he couldn't finish the sentence. "Emotionally what?" Leah insisted. "Emotionally, I can't allow myself to get attached, to you or the baby, because when this is over, it will hurt too much." The raw honesty in his voice broke Leah's heart. She realized he was so afraid of getting hurt again that he preferred to deny himself happiness rather than take the risk. "What if it didn't have to end?" Leah asked, surprising herself with her courage. "What if there was a way to?" But Brandon shook his head before she even finished. "There isn't. There can't be. We're from completely different worlds, Leah. You're young. You have a whole life ahead of you. I'm a wounded man, full of scars who doesn't know how to love properly anymore. You deserve so much more than this." He walked to the door, but she followed him. "What if I don't want more than this? What if I want exactly you, with all your scars?" Brandon stopped with his hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. "Then you're deluding yourself. Because people like me don't have happy endings, Leah. We just survive." And with those words, he left the apartment, leaving her alone with a broken heart and 1,000 unanswered questions. What do you think is the true reason for Brandon's fear? And do you believe Leah's courage to be honest will change anything? Or is he too set in his ways? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more exciting stories. In the days that followed that conversation, Brandon began to deliberately distance himself. He still appeared for medical appointments, but he would arrive shortly before the scheduled time and leave right afterward. He no longer made spontaneous visits to the apartment and no longer brought small gifts or trinkets. He was polite, but distant, as if he were trying to return to that professional coldness from the beginning. Leah missed him in a way that surprised her. She had gotten used to his presence, to their conversations, to the feeling that she wasn't completely alone in the world. Now, even living in a comfortable apartment with all her needs met, she felt lonelier than when she lived in that tiny room. Because now she knew what it was like to have someone care about her. And she also knew what it was like to lose that. During her appointments, she would try to decipher his looks, looking for signs that he also missed her. But Brandon had returned to wearing that impenetrable mask she knew so well. The situation between Leah and Brandon could have continued in that emotional stalemate for much longer, if not for an event that changed everything. Leah was 6 months pregnant when Helen appeared at the apartment on a Thursday morning, accompanied by 2 people she didn't know. An elegant man in his 60s and an immaculately dressed woman of a similar age. Helen introduced them as Mr. Mendonza, Brandon's father, and Margaret Mendonza, his stepmother. The coldness with which they greeted her immediately made Leah uncomfortable. It was obvious that they hadn't come for a social courtesy visit. "Can we talk?" Mr. Mendonza asked, looking around the apartment with an expression that made it clear what he thought of the whole situation. Leah invited them to sit in the living room, feeling her heart race. She had a bad feeling about that visit, especially because Brandon wasn't there. Mr. Mendonza got straight to the point, without beating around the bush or offering unnecessary pleasantries. "Miss Leah, I've come here because I'm worried about my son. Helen informed me that you've been meeting frequently, beyond what the contract stipulates, and that is not acceptable." His words fell like a bucket of cold water. Leah tried to maintain her composure, but felt like a child being scolded by a stern adult. "Mr. Mendonza, I don't understand what the problem is. Brandon is just checking to see if I'm okay, if I need anything for the pregnancy." Margaret let out a dry laugh. "Darling, we're not naive. We've known Brandon much longer than you have. We know when he's getting emotionally involved, and that cannot happen." Helen, who had remained silent until then, opened a folder and placed some papers on the coffee table. "Leah, they have some legitimate concerns that we need to discuss. My son went through a very painful romantic disappointment a few years ago," Mr. Mendonza continued, walking around the room as if he owned the place. "Since then, he has focused his energy on his work and the family business. This decision to have an heir was made in a rational, business-like way, exactly as it should be. But now I get the impression he's confusing things again." Leah felt a rage growing inside her. How dare they talk about Brandon as if he were a child, incapable of making his own decisions. "With all due respect, Mr. Mendonza, I think the person who should decide about Brandon's feelings is him himself." Margaret laughed again, this time with more disdain. "Oh, darling, you really think you understand the situation, don't you? Let me clarify a few things for you." She leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Brandon is a very wealthy man. Do you know that very wealthy men attract a certain type of woman?" The insinuation was clear and cruel. Leah's face flushed with indignation. "Are you suggesting that I'm trying to take advantage of the situation?" Mr. Mendonza took over before Margaret could respond. "We're not suggesting, Leah. We're stating it. We've seen this before. Young women in difficult financial situations who see in men like my son an opportunity for a life change. And Brandon, despite all his business intelligence, can be surprisingly naive when it comes to relationships." Helen placed more papers on the table. "That's why we've prepared a proposal that we think will be interesting for you." Leah looked at the documents without touching them. She had a terrible premonition about what was to come. "We are willing to double the amount agreed upon in the original contract," Helen said in a business-like tone. "In exchange, you agree to maintain emotional distance from Brandon until the baby is born, and after that to move to another city." The silence that followed was deafening. Leah looked at those three faces, waiting for her response, and felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and disappointment that she didn't know how to express. "You're trying to buy me," she finally said in a calmer voice than she felt. "You're literally putting a price on my absence from Brandon's life." Mr. Mendonza sighed as if he were dealing with a stubborn child. "We're being practical. This arrangement benefits everyone. You become rich enough to start a new life anywhere you choose. Brandon gets his heir without emotional complications, and our family keeps its reputation intact." Margaret nodded in agreement. "It's a win-win situation, as you young people like to say." Leah stood up from the chair, feeling a dignity she didn't know she possessed. "What if I say no?" Mr. Mendonza also stood up, and for the first time, his mask of politeness fell completely. "If you say no, we will make your life very difficult. We have excellent lawyers, Leah. We can question the validity of the contract, claim you're trying to emotionally extort my son, create a legal situation so complex that you'll spend what little money you have just trying to defend yourself." The threat was clear and frightening. Leah felt her legs tremble, but stood her ground. "Does Brandon know you're here?" Mr. Mendonza smiled, but it was a cold smile. "Brandon is in a very important meeting with Japanese investors. He'll be busy all day, and when he comes home tonight, we expect you to have made the right decision." Helen stood up and placed a pen next to the papers. "You have until 6 p.m. to sign. If you don't sign, we'll assume you've chosen the more difficult path." With those words, the three of them left the apartment, leaving Leah alone with the documents and the ultimatum. The hours that followed were the longest of Leah's life. She read and reread the documents, trying to understand all the legal implications. The amount offered was indeed double the original amount, enough money to live comfortably for many years. But the price was giving up any possibility of a future with Brandon and moving to a city where he could never find her. It was as if they were paying for her to completely disappear from his life. Throughout the afternoon, she waited for Brandon to appear, for him to somehow know what was happening and come to defend her. But he didn't show up. At 5:30 in the afternoon, when Helen called to ask for her decision, Leah still didn't know what to do. "I need more time," she said. "You have 30 minutes," Helen replied coldly. "By 6 o'clock sharp, either you've signed or we consider that you've chosen to oppose the Mendonza family, and I can guarantee that's not a wise choice." It was then that Leah realized something that changed everything. As she paced back and forth in the room, she put her hand on her belly and felt the baby move. It was a sensation that was becoming familiar, but this time it was different. It was as if the baby was trying to tell her something. She sat on the sofa and placed both hands on her belly. "What do I do?" she whispered to the baby. "What's right?" And suddenly, everything became clear. It wasn't just about her and Brandon. It was about the child she was carrying, about the kind of family he deserved to have. If Leah accepted that proposal, she would be teaching her child that some people were worth more than others, that love had a price, that dignity could be bought. And that was something she couldn't do, even if it meant facing the consequences. When Helen called at 6 o'clock sharp, Leah was ready with her answer. "I'm not going to sign," she said with a firmness that even surprised herself. "Then you've made your choice," Helen replied. "I hope you don't regret it." The next morning, Leah woke up to insistent knocking on the door. When she opened it, she found 2 men in suits who identified themselves as court officers. They had a warrant to seal the apartment and an immediate eviction order. "But there must be some mistake," she said, still trying to process what was happening. "I live here. I have rights." One of the men showed her the documents. "According to this, the lease has been terminated for breach of contract clauses. You have 1 hour to remove your personal belongings." Leah felt the world spinning around her. The Mendonza family hadn't wasted any time. Less than 12 hours after her refusal to sign the documents, they were already following through on the threat. She grabbed her few clothes, some personal items, and left the apartment where she had felt safe for the first time in years. She had nowhere to go, no money saved, and she was 6 months pregnant. The situation was desperate. She tried to call Brandon several times during the day, but all her calls went straight to voicemail. She sent text messages that went unanswered. She went to his company, but the receptionist said he was in meetings all day and couldn't be interrupted. It was obvious that the family had made sure he wouldn't know what was happening, at least, not right away. Leah ended up going to the only person she could trust, Mrs. Rose. The woman welcomed her into her small but cozy home, and when Leah told her everything that had happened, Mrs. Rose was indignant. "What heartless people! To do that to a pregnant girl!" She insisted that Leah stay with her until she could get organized, but they both knew it was a temporary solution. Mrs. Rose lived on a small pension and could barely support herself. 2 days later, when Leah finally managed to get in touch with Dr. Marcus, she discovered that her situation was even worse than she imagined. "Leah, I'm so sorry, but I've received a legal notification saying that I can no longer treat you. Apparently, there has been a breach of contract, and the Mendoza family is no longer responsible for your medical expenses." The doctor seemed genuinely concerned. "This is not ethical. It's not right. But legally, there's nothing I can do. You will need to seek care in the public system." The news was devastating. She was in her 6th month of pregnancy, a critical phase that required regular medical monitoring, and now she would have to start all her prenatal care over again somewhere else, with doctors who didn't know her history. When she left the clinic, Leah sat on a bench in the square in front and cried like she hadn't cried since she was a child. She felt completely abandoned, betrayed, as if she had just been a disposable object in the lives of powerful people. What do you think of the Mendoza family's cruel actions? And what do you believe Leah's response will be now that she has nothing to lose? Share your thoughts in the comments below. That night, when she returned to Mrs. Rose's house, she found Brandon waiting at the door. For a moment, her heart filled with hope. Maybe he had found out what his family had done. Maybe he was there to fix everything. But when she approached him, she saw that his eyes were cold, distant, and harder than ever. "We need to talk," he said in a voice she didn't recognize. Mrs. Rose, sensing the tension, left them alone in the small living room. "Brandon, do you know what your family did?" Leah began, but he raised his hand to interrupt her. "I know exactly what happened, and I also know that you turned down a very generous offer." The coldness in his voice chilled her to the bone. You knew they were going to offer me money to disappear from your life?" Brandon sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know the details, but I knew they were going to take some action, and maybe it's better this way." His words were like a punch to the stomach. "Better this way? They blackmailed me, threatened me, threw me out on the street, and you think it's better this way?" Leah felt tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't stop talking. "I refused their money, Brandon. I refused it because I thought there was something real between us, something worth fighting for." Brandon stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. "And that's exactly why they took action, because they saw that you were developing inappropriate expectations." The word inappropriate cut Leah's heart like a blade. "Inappropriate? Is that what you call what happened between us?" He turned to look at her, and she saw a deep pain in his eyes, but also an iron determination. "Leah, you're a young, inexperienced girl. You confused gratitude and financial security with love. It's understandable, but it's not real." The condescension in his words made her feel a rage she had never experienced. "Don't treat me like I'm a naive child. I know what I feel. I know the difference between gratitude and love, and I also know when someone is lying to himself." Brandon clenched his fists, clearly fighting against something. "Even if you knew, even if I felt something for you, it wouldn't change anything. We're from different worlds. My family will never accept you, and I can't turn my back on them." Leah stood up, placing a hand on her now very prominent belly. "And the baby? Are you going to turn your back on your own child too?" The question seemed to hit Brandon squarely. He looked at her belly for a long moment, and she saw a war of emotions cross his face. "The baby will be well taken care of," he finally said. "I will fulfill all the financial obligations of the contract, even though you broke the emotional clauses." "Financial obligations?" Leah repeated in disbelief. "You're talking about your child as if it were a business transaction." Brandon's expression hardened even more. "That's exactly what it is. That's what we agreed to from the beginning. You're the one who complicated things by creating romantic expectations where you shouldn't have." His words were like stones being thrown at Leah's heart. She realized she was facing a man who had chosen to protect himself from pain by completely closing himself off to love. "You're scared," she said softly. "Scared of being hurt again. Scared of being happy. And you're using your family as an excuse not to risk your heart." Brandon laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "Maybe I am scared. And do you know why? Because people like you always end up leaving in the end. There's always something better, someone more interesting, a more exciting life waiting. And I've already been through that once. I'm not going to go through it again." The implicit comparison to Camilla was the last straw for Leah. "I'm not her," she said in a firm voice despite the tears. "I would never be her. But you're so blinded by the pain of the past that you can't see the difference." She walked to the door, but before leaving, she turned one last time. "When this child is born, I will hand him over to you as per the contract. But know one thing, you're not just losing me. You're losing the chance to be truly happy, to have a real family. And one day, when you're alone in that big, empty mansion, you'll remember this night, and you'll know that you're the one who chose loneliness." With those words, she left, leaving Brandon alone in Mrs. Rose's living room. When the door closed behind her, he collapsed into a chair and for the first time in years, cried like a lost child. In the days that followed, Leah tried to get organized as best she could. She managed to get care at the public hospital, where the doctors were concerned about the abrupt change in her prenatal care. But they did the best they could with the resources available. Mrs. Rose helped her as much as she could, but the situation was unsustainable in the long run. Leah knew she needed a place of her own for when the baby was born. She needed stability, security. Brandon kept his word about the financial obligations, depositing the agreed-upon monthly amount into her account. But there was no more personal contact. It was as if she had become invisible to him. And maybe it was better that way, because with each passing day, the pain of rejection and abandonment grew inside her, mixed with anxiety about the future and sadness at the thought that her son would grow up without truly knowing his father. 2 weeks after the conversation at Mrs. Rose's house, Brandon was in the library of his mansion when he found an old photo album he hadn't seen in years. Between the yellowed pages, he found a photo of his mother holding him as a baby. She was smiling with a pure happiness he hadn't seen on a face in a long time. Below the photo, in his mother's delicate handwriting, it said, "Love is the only wealth that multiplies when it is shared." Brandon stared at those words for a long time, feeling a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain. His mother always said things like that. She always believed in the transformative power of love, even when life was difficult. She would have liked Leah, he thought. She would have seen the same purity and strength in her that he himself had seen, but was desperately trying to deny. That night, for the first time in weeks, he managed to admit to himself that he missed Leah. Not just her company, but who he was when he was with her. What do you think is the true meaning behind Leah's final words? And will they be enough to make Brandon change? And do you believe the Mendoza family will get what they want in the end? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. The change in Brandon began subtly. During work meetings, he would catch himself wondering how Leah was, if she was eating properly, if she wasn't having any difficulties. He knew she was receiving the contract money, but he knew her proud nature well enough to know she was probably trying to spend as little as possible, saving everything for after the baby was born. The idea that she could be in need because of his pride made him anxious. One night, he drove to Mrs. Rose's house without really knowing why. He stayed in his car across the street, watching the lit windows, wondering if Leah was inside. He didn't have the courage to get out of the car, but he stayed there for almost an hour, feeling like a love-struck teenager. When he finally got home, he realized he was acting like an idiot. Either he was willing to fight for what he felt, or he should leave Leah alone once and for all. It was Dr. Marcus who gave Brandon the final push he needed. On a Monday morning, the doctor appeared at his office unannounced. "Brandon, we need to talk," he said, with a seriousness that got his attention. "It's about Leah." Brandon's heart raced. "Is she okay? Is the baby okay?" Dr. Marcus sat in the chair across from his desk. "Physically, yes. I managed to get some information through a colleague who is treating her at the public hospital. But I'm concerned about the emotional aspect. She is clearly depressed, stressed, and that's not good for a pregnancy." Brandon felt an overwhelming guilt. "What can I do? She doesn't want to talk to me." Dr. Marcus looked him directly in the eyes. "You can stop lying to yourself about what you feel for her. I've been involved in surrogate situations for 15 years, and I've never seen two people more clearly in love trying to pretend they don't feel anything." The doctor's frankness caught Brandon off guard. "Doctor, the situation is more complicated than it seems." Dr. Marcus shook his head. "Brandon, I've been a doctor for 30 years. I've seen real complications. Two adults who love each other isn't a complication. It's a blessing. What's complicated is wasting an opportunity to be happy because of pride or fear." He got up from the chair and walked to the window. "You know what bothers me most about this whole situation? It's that you two are so busy protecting your hearts that you've forgotten about the child who's in the middle of it all. This baby is going to be born in a few weeks and deserves to have parents who at least tried to build something together." The doctor's words echoed in Brandon's mind for the rest of the day. It was true. He was being selfish, thinking only of his own pain, his own fears, without considering what would be best for the son who was on the way. That night, Brandon made a decision that would change everything. He called Helen and asked for an urgent meeting with his father and Margaret. When the three of them met the next morning, Brandon was different. There was a determination in his eyes that they hadn't seen in years. "I want you to know that I'm going to get Leah back," he announced bluntly, "and if she accepts me, I'm going to marry her." The silence that followed was tense. Mr. Mendonza was the first to react. "Brandon, be sensible. This girl is clearly trying to take advantage of you." Brandon slammed his fist on the table, something he had never done in front of his father. "Enough. Leah refused double the money you offered her to leave my life. If she was a gold digger, she would have accepted and disappeared, but she didn't accept because she feels something real for me, and I'm an idiot for having doubted that." Margaret tried to interrupt, but Brandon wouldn't let her. "And one more thing. You two are going to apologize to her. For what you did, for how you treated her, for everything." Mr. Mendonza got up from his chair, clearly irritated. "I'm not going to apologize to an opportunist who—" But Brandon interrupted him, with a voice he had never used with his father. "Dad, listen carefully to what I'm going to say. Leah is going to be the mother of my child, and if God wills it, my wife. You can accept this and try to build a respectful relationship with her, or you can continue with this attitude and lose contact with me and your grandson. The choice is yours." The firmness in Brandon's voice surprised everyone. It was the first time he had faced his family in this way, that he had put his own will above family expectations. Helen tried to mediate the situation. "Brandon, maybe we can find a middle ground." But he shook his head. "There is no middle ground here. Either you respect my choice, or we go our separate ways. I've wasted too much time trying to please everyone. Now, I'm going to do what's right for me and for my family." After the tense meeting with his family, Brandon drove directly to Mrs. Rose's house. He arrived there in the middle of the afternoon, with his heart pounding and his hands sweating. When Mrs. Rose answered the door, she looked at him with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "What do you want here?" she asked bluntly. "I want to talk to Leah." "Please, Mrs. Rose, I know I have no right to ask for anything after what happened, but I need to talk to her." Mrs. Rose studied him for a moment. "She's not here," she finally said. "She's at the hospital." Brandon's world stopped. "At the hospital? What happened? Is the baby okay?" Mrs. Rose noticed the genuine desperation in his voice. "She started having contractions last night. The doctors said it's normal, that it's not time for the baby to be born yet, but they decided to admit her for observation." Without a second thought, Brandon asked for the name of the hospital and ran out. The whole way there, he prayed that everything was okay, that it wasn't too late to fix the mistakes he had made. When he arrived at the public hospital, Brandon felt completely out of his element. It was very different from the private clinic where Leah had been receiving care before. There were huge lines, people waiting to be seen, a constant buzz of voices and movements. He managed to find out what room Leah was in and ran up the stairs. When he reached the door of the room, he hesitated for a moment. What if she didn't want to see him? What if it was too late? He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "Come in," a weak voice he immediately recognized said. When he opened the door and saw Leah lying in the hospital bed, pale and visibly tired, he felt his heart break. She looked at him with surprise, but didn't say anything. "How are you?" he asked, approaching her slowly. "Is the baby okay?" Leah nodded slightly. "Everything is fine. It was just a scare." There was a distance in her voice that hurt more than any scream could hurt. "Leah," Brandon began, sitting in the chair beside the bed. "I came here because I need to tell you some things. Things I should have said a long time ago." She looked at him without speaking, waiting. "First, I want to apologize. For everything. For letting my family treat you that way. For doubting your feelings. For being a coward when I should have fought for us." The words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid she would interrupt him before he could say everything. "Second, I want you to know that I love you. I love your strength, your purity, your ability to see the good in people even when they don't deserve it. I love how you make coffee in the morning, how you sing softly when you think no one is listening, how you touch your belly when you talk to the baby." Leah felt her eyes filling with tears, but still didn't say anything. "And third," Brandon continued, taking her hand, "I want you to marry me. Not because of the baby, not because of the contract, but because I can't imagine my life without you." The silence that followed Brandon's proposal seemed to last an eternity. Leah looked at him with a mixture of love, pain, and disbelief in her eyes. Tears ran freely down her face, but she still couldn't speak. Brandon held her hand more tightly, as if he feared she would disappear. "I know I hurt you," he continued with a choked voice. "I know I have a lot to make up for, a lot to prove, but if you give me a chance, just one chance, I will spend the rest of my life showing you how much you mean to me." Leah finally found her voice, but it was a fragile whisper. "Brandon, you destroyed me. When I needed you most, when your family humiliated me and threw me out on the street, you chose them. How can I be sure it won't happen again?" The pain in her voice cut his heart like a blade. He knew he deserved every word, every question, every doubt she had. "Because this time I chose you before anything else," Brandon replied, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it softly. "Before I came here, I had a very serious conversation with my father and Margaret. I made it clear that you are my priority now, that any disrespect to you is a disrespect to me. And if they can't accept that, then they will lose a son and a grandson." Leah looked at him in surprise. She knew the complex relationship Brandon had with his family. She knew how much they meant to him. The fact that he had faced them all for her was something she didn't expect. "Did you really do that?" Brandon nodded. "I did, and I would do it 1,000 times again if necessary, because I learned one thing in these weeks away from you. Nothing is worth it if I can't share it with the person I love. all the money in the world, all the success, all the family approval. It means nothing if I'm alone. Leah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process everything he was saying. Part of her wanted to throw herself into his arms and say yes immediately. But the part that had been hurt, abandoned, and humiliated needed more assurances. And what if your family never accepts me? What if there's always tension, conflict? Our son will grow up in the middle of all that. Brandon got up from the chair and knelt beside the bed, getting to her eye level. Then we will build our own family, our own circle of love. You, me, our son, and the people who truly care about our happiness. Like Mrs. Rose, like Dr. Marcus, like all the good people you've brought into my life. He gently touched her belly, where the baby was moving softly. This baby will be born into a family where love is more important than money, where happiness is worth more than appearances. I promise that. To you and to him. At that moment, as if he had heard his father's words, the baby gave a strong kick that they both felt. Leah and Brandon laughed through their tears, and for the first time in weeks, she saw the kind and vulnerable man she had fallen in love with, hidden behind all those defenses. I think he's saying he approves, she said softly. Brandon smiled, that genuine smile she had missed so much. Or he's telling his daddy to stop making his mommy cry. He became serious again, looking directly into her eyes. Leah, I can't go back in time and change the things I did. I can't erase the pain I caused. But I can promise that from now on, I will fight for us, every day. I will be the man you deserve, the father our son deserves, if you'll let me. Leah felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, a true love that had finally overcome all fears. Yes, she finally said, and the word came out as a whisper full of hope. Yes, I will marry you. Brandon kissed her with infinite tenderness, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. It was a kiss full of promises, of forgiveness, of a future they could finally build together. When they parted, both were crying and laughing at the same time. I love you so much, Brandon murmured against her lips. And I love you too, Leah replied. Even when I tried to hate you, even when I thought you had abandoned me, I never stopped loving you. In that moment, they felt the baby move again, as if he were approving of his parents' reconciliation. It was as if the family that was forming had finally found its balance. 3 weeks later, when Leah went into true labor, Brandon didn't leave her side for a single minute. He held her hand during all the contractions, whispered words of encouragement in her ear, and cried with emotion when he heard the baby's first cry. When the doctor placed the child in Leah's arms, Brandon felt a love so intense he thought his heart would explode. It was a perfect baby boy, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's delicate face. Hi, my love, Leah whispered to the baby. You're finally here. Brandon gently touched his son's little face. Welcome to the world, little one. Your mommy and daddy love you very much. In that moment, looking at his wife and son, Brandon knew he had made the right decision. This was his family, his true wealth. The wedding took place 2 months later, in a small but love-filled ceremony. Mrs. Rose was Leah's matron of honor. Dr. Marcus was Brandon's best man, and little Julian slept peacefully in his mother's arms throughout the ceremony. The Mendoza family attended, still a bit hesitant, but clearly trying to make amends. Mr. Mendoza even apologized to Leah, admitting that he had misjudged the situation. Welcome to the family, he said, and despite the formality, Leah realized he was sincere. Margaret was still adjusting, but had made a genuine effort to be polite and respectful. The change had not been easy for any of them, but everyone understood that Brandon had made his choice and that respecting it was the only way to keep the family together. 6 months after the wedding, Leah was on the balcony of the new house they had bought together. Not the cold mansion where Brandon lived alone, but a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood in Charlotte, watching Brandon play with Julian in the garden. The baby laughed heartily every time his father made funny faces, and Leah's heart warmed with the scene. She had gone back to school and was majoring in education, finally fulfilling her dream of becoming a teacher. Brandon supported her in everything, taking care of the baby when she needed to study, and always saying he was proud of her determination. Mrs. Rose visited every week and had become a surrogate grandmother to Julian. Dr. Marcus continued to be the family doctor and always said he had never seen a more loving couple. "You know what?" Brandon said, approaching the balcony with Julian in his arms. "I think my mother would be very proud to see how our family turned out." Leah smiled, hugging the two men in her life. "I'm sure she's watching from above and smiling down on us." In that moment, watching the sunset with her family in her arms, Leah knew that all the pain, all the struggle, all the uncertainty had been worth it. Sometimes, the most difficult paths are the ones that lead to the greatest happiness. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of another story here on the A Thread of Hope channel. Leah and Brandon's journey teaches us that true love sometimes needs to go through storms to become stronger. That the courage to fight for what we feel, even when everything seems lost, can transform our lives in ways we never imagined. Leah showed us that dignity has no price, that our inner strength is greater than any hardship. Brandon learned that the fear of being hurt cannot stop us from loving, and that sometimes we need to face our own demons to find happiness. Today, they form a beautiful family, built on the solid foundations of love, respect, and forgiveness. They proved that no matter where we come from or what obstacles we face, when two souls truly meet, the universe conspires to bring them together. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those you love. Comment below. Do you believe that love can overcome any obstacle? Until the next story, and remember, never lose hope. Love always finds a way. God bless you.